here's a wild thought. What if the different tools to understand the world around us, like language, philosophy, religion, science, all these fundamental tools are flawed in the first place? Can we really trust them? Many philosophers poured their entire lives in search of quote unquote the truth. But what if there is no truth? What even is truth? What if it's all just pointless? So let's deal with science first. So science works by empirical observations, experimentation, and then coming up with a model to explain some particular phenomena. And it's very powerful. Like, it took us from mere apes to now literally building computers at atomic scales and literally sending rovers to other planets. It's crazy. And it uses what I call like a pyramid of certainty. At the top, we have got mathematics. It's pure, it's logical, it's precise, it's beautiful because it works with very simple objects like lines and circles and numbers. Then we define everything clearly about that object, lay out our assumptions, and boom, we have got absolute certainty. 2 plus 2 equals to 4. No one can deny that. Just by repetition of this simple process of deductive reasoning and abstraction, maths reveals to us knowledge previously hidden from us. Next step in the pyramid is physics. Now, physics is a bit less accurate and includes more broader assumptions as we are dealing with more complicated things and real things. Already the need for logical rigor becomes a second priority. What our aim is to build a precise model and then use those to make predictions which are accurate. But in physics, from the little knowledge that I have, there is a huge problem that these models we create for how the universe works seem to break down depending on the scale we are talking about. Like, if you're talking about atoms and electrons, things behave according to a different model, and when you're talking about huge things like black holes and supernovas, they behave according to a different model, which is a huge problem. We use approximations that would make any mathematician frown with the lack of rigor. Actually, Einstein put this situation perfectly. He said, as far as the laws of mathematics refer to reality, they are not certain. And as far as they are certain, they do not refer to reality. As we go down deeper into the pyramid to chemistry, it discusses even more complicated systems. Hence, it is even more abstract and less rigorous in its approach, with even less generalizable results, and thus less certain. My point is basically that science as a method of inquiry into truths works because it relies on mathematical deduction, and as we go further and further from this principle, we also move further from the idea of absolute certainty. Not to mention, science itself has assumptions. Like, it assumes the universe is governed by consistent laws, and the fact that we can trust our senses to make empirical observations about the world. Like, we cannot take those things for granted, to be honest. There are questions that humanity has been struggling with forever, like consciousness, etc. But science doesn't seem to have even a framework to approach these kinds of questions, right? So we turn to different fields like philosophy, political science, psychology to deal with these sorts of questions. Maybe these problems do not have any solutions, like who knows? But when we enter to the realm of philosophy and political science, our logical rigor seems to fade away. We completely start discussing things in terms of analogies, stories, emotions, which introduce a whole bunch of complexity and confusion to something which is already very complex. It seems like the more complicated the topic gets, more we humans dumb them down for ourselves, because like treating them as rigorously as a mathematician would become completely humanly impossible at this point. I think to look deeper into this, we need to understand something first. I think the main culprit behind this is, well, language. Now, language is a tool we use to communicate with each other, but it's often ignored how complicated language is and what role it plays in our understanding of the world. Some people like Ludwig Wittgenstein have even went on to say that the language you speak actually dictates your entire worldview. So language is made up of words, but what are words? Socrates raised the same question. Like everyone was chill until he asked what words like justice and knowledge actually mean. Like no matter how many definitions people tried to come up with, he could always find some sort of counter example where that definition wouldn't fit. This problem arises because he thought of words as labels attached to things, which, in my opinion, is just dumb. You can't really associate words with things. At first, it may seem like what's wrong with it. It works fine for things like an apple. You can associate with some, as you can associate it with some particular thing in the real world. But words aren't always just a bunch of syllables that are attached to an object or an idea. Words have complicated meanings and carry the burden and context of their historical usage. Any one of you who engages in any kind of discussion must have realized the amount of semantic gap there is between people when you are trying to convey something. This leads to misunderstanding and ineffective communication. Language is almost never interpreted as you actually mean it. And you don't even know how the other person you are debating with is actually interpreting your words. Some people say you can use the Oxford Dictionary towards semantic misunderstandings, right? It may have some use, but with words like society, religion, God, consciousness, the contextual burden these words carry is so great that it is only a brutal simplification to reduce them to just two-liner definitions. No one can do that. So being ignorant of this fact is a crime. I think that when we hear a word, we form an image in our minds. Each word goes through a lens comprising of our emotions, our past experiences, our personal values, and this mental image is different for everyone as everyone has a different lens. Like take the word Palestine for example. Like if you look at the Wikipedia definition for this word, you would get something pretty simple, referring to it as a geographic location in Middle East or something. But when you hear that word, even though it's just a fixed objective geographic entity, different people, let's say a guy who knows nothing about Palestine, someone who is a Jew, someone who is a Muslim, a person who just read Palestinian history, someone who knows the culture of that place, each person would have a different idea of the word Palestine in their head. And this is the subjective burden that is ignored in conversations. So, to an extent, there are actually thousands of different versions of this word Palestine, but in conversation, they are just clubbed into one. So, think about the last heated argument that you had. Were you and the other person actually even talking about the same thing? Because language isn't just about dictionary definitions, right? It's a maze of personal experiences, emotions, and cultural baggage. Now, the second pillar on which we form all our worldviews, in my opinion, is morality. According to me, morality is also subjective. For me, morality is simply a function of emotions and generationally passed on learnings from our ancestors, which again at the root are human emotions. And human emotions are subjective, thus leading to morality being subjective. Like, for example, some morals are based on disgust, some are based on fear. Now, what certain individual feels disgusted by, or what someone's deepest fears are, are subjective, thus leading to them having different moral principles, which in turn guide the person's entire worldview and how they interpret your words. The third pillar is the concept of perceived value. We often ignore in our discussions the subjective value attached by every individual to an object. What I mean by that is, let's say I have two copies of the exact same football, but one of them is like a football maybe Ronaldo played with his last match, right? Now, this football has a higher perceived value than the other football. So, when discussing anything regarding these footballs, let's say their price, I think it's crucial factor to consider the fact that one of them is the football that Ronaldo played with. This becomes especially important in discussions involving historical, religious, or things of artistic importance. For example, the Ram Mandir issue or the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? But we conveniently ignore this. Some people may have more perceived value for a certain building. So, even though you are discussing the same building, different people are interpreting it from a different lens, thus forming a completely different mental image from your words, which you can never truly understand, thus causing a gap in understanding, which renders the debate pointless. Whenever we talk about politics or history, we fail to do an accurate analysis of this perceived value of objects, which couples with the things that I discussed earlier, which is a recipe for confusion. Again, this laziness and ignorance is completely understandable, as it would be another impossible thing to account for the human mind. But nevertheless, in principle, I think it is an important variable to account for. Now try to wrap your head around this. During any said political discussion, thousands of words are being used which all have a deep rooted context, and the subjective image created in everyone's mind for each one of them is different. There are hundreds of variables that play into the discussion, and each variable has a subjective perceived value based on history, culture, which is again thousands of years old. And we dump all this down and look at the world through a lens or a perspective of our own making. And every experience we have slightly alters this lens. What we feel empathetic towards, what we feel disgusted by, etc., etc. And these tiny nudges make everyone a different person. Like, just think about it, right? There have been thousands of scientists, philosophers from Adi Shankaracharya, Aristotle to Buddha who spent their entire lives contemplating about the world. Why them? Even after so much effort in the search for truth, are their truths just completely different? No matter how much they try, they make subjective judgments based on their own life experiences and morality and all that other jazz I discussed above. I think this is because we haven't developed a proper tool for engaging in good discussions. I don't know if something like that is even possible, but see, I am not saying that all these discussions are pointless or useless. I am just basically urging for humbleness in the fact that we can't really be opinionated on these things. We are forced to live on the edge of yes and no with most of these things. This could actually be a very healthy mindset in the model world where people have become so opinionated and polarized politically, right? I also see that some people have a tendency to think that they are some sort of moral superheroes and the other side and seeing the other side as like vicious demons or evil or something, right? This makes me think like we humans only possess a certain level of cognitive abilities. Are we even capable of logically discussing these extremely complicated ideas? Or are these questions just stupid and don't make any sense and they are just um, play of language? We should really question our capabilities and at least be a little humble about how little we know, right? We don't know. Like, these are my three favorite words. This perspective just makes you way less arrogant about your views.